Moses Itauma versus Dillian Whyte, a prediction. Potentially, this is going to be a great fight. And there's so many different variables. So let's try and analyze what could potentially happen in this fight. And whatever the outcome, hopefully we will have a contest that will be competitive and will be outstanding. So, like I said, there's so many variables here. So I'm going to begin with stating, what does Dillian Whyte need to do? What does Dillian Whyte need to do to win this fight? So these are just certain things that I think could be effective. Now the first thing, and I've mentioned this before, is that Moses Itauma, feinting with the right hand because he's a southpaw, he will feint and then he will jab to the body. And that leaves a temporary opening here, which means that if Dillian can get his timing correct, he can counter with that left hook. Now, there's a caveat here because if you think about it, Dillian Whyte has been out of action for a long time. So his timing is probably going to be off due to the ring rust. So he might not attempt this counter early on, but definitely in the middle rounds, this could be a useful counter. Secondly, and this is just an idea, he might consider, obviously you're using the lead hand to blur the vision, but also consider putting the left hand, which is Dillian Whyte's lead hand, on Moses Itauma's right shoulder to try and control his lead hand. This is something for a reference. This is a reference point. This is something that George Foreman tried to do against Michael Moorer. He would use his left hand and sometimes place it on the shoulder to try and measure it and try and negate it. So that's a tactic that he could attempt. And also, I think, and this is an important one, the counter left hook. As I've stated, time and time and time and time again, Dillian Whyte has a great left hook as a lead and as a counter. And one of the reasons why it's so great is that it's short. It's a short left hook, but he generates so much power. It would be great if he could time Moses Itauma's right hook. So when Moses Itauma is throwing his right hook, there's the opening for the left hook. If he could time the left hook over it, that could be an effective shot. That can potentially be a knockout shot. So that's something that, again, it might be unwise to try that too early because his timing is likely going to be off due to the ring rust. But it is something he can implement in the middle to later rounds, assuming the fight goes that far. So additionally to this, I think there may be an opportunity. I've been watching a little bit of Moses Itauma, and I've noticed in the clinches, he just seems to just switch off. This is a negative habit. He could be setting a trap, but it doesn't look like it. It looks like he switches off, which means there's an opportunity to deliver punches. The short left hook would be great, but he could try the right hand over the top. He could go body and head. There's variations here, but I hope that they've seen this habit and that they're drilling a particular sequence that they can do in the clinch, because I've noticed that, when I've watched Moses Itauma fights in the first round, there may be a clinch or two, and that's a potential opportunity for Dillian Whyte to do something effective. I think another thing is, and this goes without saying, he needs to get the fight into the middle rounds. Moses Itauma is likely, considering his form, he's likely to be brutal and explosive early on. This is similar to when Dillian Whyte versus Anthony Joshua. Anthony Joshua was very dangerous early on, and it's important that Dillian Whyte maintains his composure, and he probably will because of his wealth of experience, and he's fought at a very high level. But it's very important that he gets the fight into the middle rounds unscathed. This will give him a greater opportunity, and inevitably the longer the fight goes, the more the tempo is going to slow down, and this is when Dillian Whyte's experience and boxing intelligence can really take precedent. And this is where, in theory, he should have the superior boxing IQ. So he will be able to set traps that Moses Itauma has never seen before in a professional ring. He may have seen it in sparring, but he's never seen it in in the professional context. And if you can put pressure on a young fighter and get a young fighter to make mistakes, those traps can make a significant difference. Another thing he can try is, I think he should put his head on Moses Itauma's chest, because that is another look that Moses Itauma will probably be unfamiliar with. Now, if you look at the fight between Dillian Whyte and Derek Chisora, a lot of the fight that took place was Derek Chisora putting his head on Dillian Whyte's chest. But I think Dillian Whyte should consider at times when the pace slows down and when they're getting close, put the head on the chest, really rough him up, and see how he copes with that style. And of course, if he's able to deal with that style effectively, then you change to something else. But it would be interesting to see what happens. Also, Dillian Whyte should, obviously utilize his feints, utilize the jab. He needs to engage in the battle of the jabs. Very difficult for a southpaw. He may not win the battle of the jabs, but he needs to engage in the battle of the jabs. That will be crucial. Now, with regards to the question here is, what type of punches should Dillian Whyte throw? What type of punches should Dillian Whyte throw? I've got a few suggestions. So I think the double left hook could be effective, particularly on the inside. I think the double left hook could do something. I also think with a southpaw, if you throw the straight right to the body and then the left hook to the head, that can be effective. I feel like when you throw the straight right to the body, when the southpaw brings it down, that can leave a little small gap for the left hook to the head. I also think the left hook to the body and the left hook to the head, and the right uppercut to the body can also be an effective combination, because the left hook raises the glove up and then that gives you the target for the right uppercut to go into the body, and that can be a very devastating shot, similar to the way that Daniel Dubois threw the illegal shot, but the right uppercut to the body in, I believe it was round 5 in the first Usyk fight. He didn't set it up with a left hook. He set it up, I think, with a feint, and then he threw the right uppercut to the body. But the left hand was the deflection. It was the distraction to the power shot. So I think there's something in that, and I feel like because Moses Itauma is a small heavyweight by modern day standards, depending on his body, if he's fighting tall, the uppercut probably won't work. But if he starts to sit down on his punches, then the uppercut could be effective. Obviously, if he starts to sit down and have a lower, if he has a lower sense of gravity, for want of a better word, that means he'll be punching harder, so maybe you use movement. But if he does get inside and he goes low, then the uppercuts can be effective. Now, let's address another thing. There's a rumor going around that Dillian Whyte is in incredible shape. I sincerely hope that that's true, and I really want Dillian Whyte to do well in this fight. Even if he loses, I want him to go out on his shield and give a really good performance, because I feel that he's given so much to boxing. He's given us some really good fights. Now, it's important though that when we talk about shape, that we define what good shape is within the boxing context, because there's fitness shape and there's boxing shape. And I have a reference. When Riddick Bowe fought Andrew Golotto in the first fight, he was clearly out of shape. And then what he did, he had a rematch with Golotto, and he came in lighter, and he looked in good shape. But unfortunately, he may have been in better fitness shape, but he wasn't in boxing shape, because as soon as he got hit, his legs went and he just didn't have the punch resistance. So what am I saying? There's being in shape and then there's being in boxing shape. Being in boxing shape means that you need to absorb punishment, and you can look in great shape. You could be like 5% body fat, but someone could hit you to the body and then you fall apart. That means you're in shape aesthetically, visually, but you're not in boxing shape. Let me give you another reference. Dave Allen versus Johnny Fisher, the second fight. Dave Allen looked out of shape, but to a certain extent he was in boxing shape. The extra weight he put on was intentional, because that extra weight was to absorb. The extra weight was to absorb the body shots, or to absorb the body and head shots, and it was effective. He was able to put on effective pressure. Now again, visually, he didn't look like he was in shape, but he was in boxing shape. So when people are saying Dillian Whyte's in great shape, and I hope that's the case, are they referring to how his physique looks, or are they referring to what's going on in sparring and what's going on in the gym? I don't know, but it's important to make that distinction. So we've spoken a bit about Dillian Whyte, right? But how does Moses Itauma win the fight? Now, because Moses Itauma has had a lot of activity recently, and he's been, he looks vicious at the moment, there is the unfortunate possibility that if the fight ends early, you would probably put your money on Moses Itauma. Dillian Whyte could end the fight. I mean, if you get hit by that Dillian Whyte left hook, you're going to sleep, whether it's round 1 or round 12, if he hits you properly. But if you was to put figures on it, you'd probably say, yeah, if it's going to be an early night, you would probably favour Moses Itauma. However, it's really essential that you don't bank your whole camp on that. It's essential that Moses Itauma is conditioned to be able to excel, not just at the beginning of the fight, but in the middle rounds, because there's a strong possibility that a fighter of Dillian Whyte's caliber, and if he's motivated, and if he's got the right strategy, and he's got a good team behind him, that this fight could go to the middle rounds, or it could go the distance. So it's important that in those middle rounds that he's strong. So what would we be looking for? I would be hoping that his mobility is still good in the middle rounds. So say if he wants to take a break or he wants to avoid the punches, he can just move out of the way without no problems. So I want to be able to see that. I want to see effective head movement, and I've noticed in his fights he has really good hand placement. So I want to see him being able to maintain that good hand placement as the fight progresses. I also think it's important that Dillian Whyte does incorporate body punching into his game. So I think that he needs to work on taking the body punches away from Dillian Whyte. So typically, and here's a reference point, I remember Evander Holyfield, who has a tremendous left hook to the body, and Riddick Bowe in the third fight, he caught the left hook, I think, to the body and then threw a right uppercut. And what that does, that deters your opponent from initiating a body attack. So if Dillian Whyte does start to go to the body, it's important that he hits Dillian Whyte with sharp counters, which will nullify his body attack and nullify his punch output. So I'll be looking for that, and of course this is part of the boxing intelligence that we'd be looking for. Additionally to this, we're looking at his composure. If he gets put under pressure, how does he react? And it's important, extremely important, that he negates Dillian Whyte's left hook, not just at the beginning, but also in the middle rounds. You kind of want to do what Lennox Lewis did to Tommy Morrison, who had a phenomenal left hook. He negated it. And also when he fought David Tua again had a phenomenal left hook, and he took that left hook away. So he needs to take it away. He needs to be able to counter it effectively, and this is a really serious weapon. Additionally to this, Dillian Whyte will be setting traps, and he needs to be able to effectively nullify those traps. And we'll give a bit of context to this when we talk about the sparring in the camps. Another thing that I think Moses Itauma needs to do, he needs to use the uppercut, because it seems that every time that Dillian Whyte gets knocked down or knocked out, an uppercut is involved. Let's give some reference. Tyson Fury knocked out Dillian Whyte with an uppercut. Povetkin knocked out Dillian Whyte, I think, with a left uppercut. And I believe Anthony Joshua scored his stoppage with a right uppercut. So the uppercuts are a very effective weapon, and I'd be looking for Moses Itauma to utilize those uppercuts, particularly if Dillian Whyte plants his feet and starts to bend down and gets a lower sense of gravity, because that means he'll be more susceptible. Also, I think punch output will be important for Moses Itauma. It's important that he's composed, but at the same time, he needs to have a consistent punch output, because like I said, this potentially could be a long fight. And also we'll be looking for punch creativity, punch to the head, punch to the body. I always say this: the right uppercut to the head, left hook to the body. That would be reverse for Moses Itauma. But you need to be doing combinations that are body, head, head, body, and also going through phases. And in fairness, Moses Itauma does do that. He sometimes does the jab, straight left, and then he'll do the jab, overhand left. So we want him to go through the phases with the punching. So I think these are some of the keys that both fighters will need to utilize if they're going to be successful. Okay, so let's talk about the trainers, the men behind the boxers. And the team behind the boxers is always, I think, really essential. So, typically you got like a Manny Pacquiao, and, behind him was Freddie Roach. And Freddie Roach did a fantastic job of developing him as a world champion. And Lennox Lewis, typically when Lennox Lewis got with Emmanuel Stewart, his career grew exponentially. So who's in your team is essential. And of course, it's not just trainers. You'll have nutritionists, you'll have strength condition people, you'll have a team. But within this conversation, we're just going to talk about the actual trainers, the boxing trainers. These are the people that are teaching you technique and are giving you advice, and typically will be with you, through the whole process of the fight camp. So these are essential people. And I guess one of the questions is, what makes someone an effective trainer? And I think one of the things that makes someone an effective trainer is effective communication. You have to be able to communicate effectively. And in various ways, you need to communicate effectively in camp. So you need to communicate what are the strategies to beat your opponent. You need to communicate what your opponent brings to the table. But also, in the minute rounds, you need to be able to identify the puzzles, but also be able to communicate to your fighter how to solve the puzzles. So the trainer holds a real essential role. Let's first start with Dillian Whyte. So he has Buddy McGirt, to my understanding, former champion. I think he's actually currently working with Callum Smith, and Callum Smith had a fantastic victory against Buatsi. I actually watched that fight, and I like both guys, but Callum Smith was really good that night, and he had so many different tricks. It looked like he had so many different game plans, so much punch creativity Callum Smith had in that fight. I remember the short left hook to the head, then a big left hook to the body, and then he would vary it with the left hook, the short left hook to the head, and then the right hand over the top, and then he'll go back to the jab. Like, there was just, he just had different punch variations. And I can imagine being an opponent that would be very difficult to deal with. So Buddy McGirt is a very credible trainer. And I've said this in a previous video, but he basically made some statements which I thought were quite telling. He said, can Dillian Whyte do something that he has not seen? So who is he? Obviously, he's talking about Moses Itauma. And I think when he's talking about can he do something he hasn't seen, I don't think Moses Itauma has ever seen within the professional ring. He may have seen it in sparring, but he hasn't dealt with a left hook like Dillian Whyte's before. He also, within the professional ranks, has not dealt with the different traps that will be set by Dillian Whyte. So and also the punch creativity, he wouldn't have dealt with that either. So I think there's definitely some credibility to that. And then he made a reference point, which is very common, which is they're going to take him into deep waters. And again, if it goes to the middle rounds, and particularly if Dillian Whyte is able to get off anything to the body, there'll be a huge potential that they could take him to the later rounds, i.e. those deep waters, and which is figurative language for a hard fight. And then it doesn't just become a question about Moses Itauma's talent and Moses Itauma's physical attributes. It will then become a question of his mental strength and his boxing intelligence. And also McGirt talked about sharpening his defense and being smart. And again, I feel like the question then becomes, what does it mean to fight smart in boxing? And I feel like utilizing those traps is part of being smart. Making sure that, nullifying your opponent is fighting smart, and being aware of your opponent's strengths and consciously taking those strengths away. If you look at the Evander Holyfield-Mike Tyson fight, Mike Tyson is known for a devastating left hook and a devastating right hook. But Evander took those tools away with effective counter-punching. So when Tyson would throw the right hand, Holyfield would roll with it and throw the right hook. And then when Tyson would throw the left hook, he would dip, throw it, and Evander would catch it, roll with it, and then throw the left hook back. And effectively, he took Tyson's best weapon and nullified it. And I think that's a real example of fighting smart. So it seems to me that from what McGirt is saying, if we take it on face value, that Dillian Whyte is going to be implementing his boxing intelligence and experience. So that to me would be nullifying his opponent. And because he has that knowledge and that experience, he should be able to, he will be more adapted to the crowd, to the big occasion. And one of the questions will be, how will Moses Itauma react to the occasion? Because we know that Dillian Whyte has been on the big stages many times. So that experience in fighting smart is, setting those traps and nullifying your opponent's weapons. So I think what we can safely say here is that McGirt is a very credible trainer, and it looks like that they've seemed to have a really good relationship, and this is definitely a positive for Dillian Whyte. Now, I'm not sure about his camp with regards to his nutritionist. I don't know too much about that, but I do think Buddy McGirt will bring some will bring some interesting elements to his game. And again, when you look at the Callum Smith performance, Callum Smith he was multifaceted in that fight, and I expect Dillian Whyte to potentially be able to do the same. He'll be setting traps and he'll be fighting intelligently, he'll be fighting smart. So let's look at Moses Itauma. And Moses Itauma's trainer is Ben Davidson. He is a well-respected trainer. I know that there's loads of stuff online about he's not well-respected, and he's there's a whole load of nonsense really. But the objective reality is this: if you train Tyson Fury and you trained Anthony Joshua and you trained Fabio Wardley, you can't train these type of guys and not be credible and respected within the boxing circles. So he is a credible trainer. To me, I think he's a strategist. I've noticed his fighters, they utilize the feint really effectively, and they utilize the pull counter, the right hand pull counter, which is something that Floyd Mayweather used to use a lot, is something that Ben Davidson's fighters seem to do a lot. And a reference point to that would be the Anthony Joshua versus Ngannou. So the pull counter, and he actually tried to use it a lot against Triple D, Daniel Dubois. So Anthony Joshua tried to use the right hand pull counter against Daniel Dubois. He wasn't effective in that fight, but he was very effective when he used it against Ngannou. When I've seen footage of Moses Itauma with Ben Davidson, Moses looks very sharp. And again, I think Ben Davidson will be giving him drills. They'll be looking at the video and they'll be analyzing his strengths and analyzing his weaknesses. And like I said, when Ben Davidson has spoken about Moses, he says that Moses is like a student of the game, similar to Mike Tyson. So that to me would indicate that, clearly Ben Davidson is a student of the game as a trainer, and he'll be watching the tapes. But it seems that Moses Itauma will be very receptive to that because he's also a student of the game. So again, I think that Ben Davidson is a good addition to to Moses Itauma, and I believe he's been with Ben Davidson since the beginning, so they should have they should have a solid foundation with regards to having a good partnership, having a good understanding of each other. Obviously there's questions to ask to be asked in terms of if and when Moses Itauma is in a crisis, will he be receptive to what Ben Davidson is telling him? And I actually think Ben Davidson is actually a really good communicator. I think he's a very clear and concise communicator, particularly in between rounds. But I think what we can surmise here is that Dillian Whyte and Ben Davidson have very respectable coaches. So like I said, so both trainers have high credentials and both are very respectable. So the other thing to discuss that I think is important is what type of sparring will they bring to the camp. So I think if you look at the Moses camp, let's talk about the Moses camp. I think if I was in the Moses camp and I was the trainer or the strategist, I would be looking for sparring partners to have like the following. I think anyone who's sparring against Moses Itauma for the Dillian Whyte fight needs to have a great left hook. And it can't be, if someone has a great left hook but they throw it like that, that's not good enough, because Dillian Whyte is going to be throwing it short. So they need to have a great short left hook and a great counter left hook. That is essential. So the ideal person, I think, would be someone who has a great left hook, someone who's physically powerful, because Dillian Whyte is physically powerful. He can push you back because he has a lot of physical strength. And also someone who has good boxing intelligence, because Dillian Whyte does set a lot of traps. So you need to imitate those traps in the sparring. And what would be good is, I think if I was looking at the sparring, I'd be like, right, let's get my fighter tired, and then let's put in some new sparring partners, and then let's test those traps against him, and let's see if he can cognitively deal with those traps in terms of, does he understand what the opponent's trying to do, and does he have the ability to be able to nullify effectively that puzzle. I also think that, the mid-round sparring would be essential in terms of countering the body attacks, because inevitably that's what should be coming, and Buddy McGirt is a big advocate for punching the body. And I was thinking about this, what would be the typical build for a sparring partner, because you want the physical dimensions to replicate the physical dimensions of Dillian Whyte. And if you look at Dillian Whyte's build, so you would think, I would say around 6'3 to 6'5 and around 240 to 255 would probably be, anywhere in between that would be good. If it's lighter, then they would have probably better hand speed, but they may not have the power, and it may not be a good duplication. And if it's over 255, then probably you're going to be dealing with a sparring partner that's too slow to imitate Dillian Whyte's punches. Also, from what I remember, Dillian Whyte, often as many good boxers do, put their weight on their back foot. So again, he needs to be dealing with the trajectory of the punches. So sparring partners shouldn't be fighting tall like many European fighters. You want to get guys that predominantly put their weight on their back foot. Now let's talk about traps, because one of the biggest things, because the question would be, what can Dillian Whyte bring to the table that Moses Itauma hasn't seen? What can Dillian Whyte bring to the table that Moses Itauma hasn't seen? And I think it will be the boxing traps that he can set. And of course, boxing traps has a relationship with boxing intelligence. So one of the boxing traps that he has is that he has that right hand feint. So he'll feint with the right hand and then the left hook to the body. So again, you would want your sparring partners to duplicate this. So you want to be able to defend it and then be effectively able to counter it. And also be aware that if you're reading the trap, that Dillian Whyte will have the boxing intelligence to adapt it. So if you're reading the feint right hand and then the left hook to the body, he might change it for the left hook to the head. So you have to be wary of that. So that's one trap. The second trap is the walk back counter trap, which basically is when Dillian Whyte, he steps back, he invites you in, and then if you come in, he can either hit you with that hard left hook. Now you're walking into the punch, so it's doubling the intensity, or if you overreach, he can then counter with the right hand. So that's another trap that the sparring partners need to be duplicating, particularly when Moses Itauma is tired. And then you have, and this is essential, the clinch and hit. And this is where, Dillian Whyte will hold with one arm, but then he'll be hitting you with the other hand. And I think it's really important that he's able to deal with this. First of all, he needs to be switched on in the clinches, because I think that is an issue. But secondly, he needs to deal with that old pros trick, because if a referee is positioned here, you can grab someone's arm here and then hit him with the free hand, and then from the referee's vision, they can't see that you're essentially stopping this hand from doing anything. So it's essential that he has awareness of these traps and has some type of drills to counter those traps effectively. Let's talk about Dillian Whyte and his camp. And clearly, Dillian Whyte's camp, the sparring will need to duplicate the following. They'll need to duplicate the southpaw style, they'll need to duplicate the speed and the power. So ideally, you would have a combination of sparring partners that are powerful and fast. So you might have a sparring partner that's just fast, and you could use that sparring partner to be able to adapt to the timing, but then you need to bring in another sparring partner that's fast and hits hard, and then you duplicate that accordingly. Now, according to some sources, one of the sparring partners is Mike Perez. Now, Mike Perez, if he's in shape, has speed, he has power, and at one stage he was a formidable contender. So if he's in shape, that's the caveat, if he's in shape, he will have all the essential elements to provide some really good sparring. Also, and this is obvious, you'd need your sparring partners to duplicate the punch variations that Moses typically uses. So I think against McLean, which I think is his best performance, it's like he feinted and then he threw the right hook and then the left hand over the top. So essentially it's like getting your sparring partners to do that combination to be able to deal with the combination, but then deal with the counter. So there's various ways to counter that. As he's throwing the right hook, do you time the left hook over the top, or do you wait for him to throw the right hook and then the overhand left and then counter? But it's important that he has a concise and efficient strategy to deal with the various punch combinations that Moses Itauma has. I also think that with Moses Itauma, I don't think I can say this with conviction, but it seems like he varies from punching into the target and through the target, so therefore your sparring would need to duplicate that. So, for example, when he did against McLean, the right hand was at the target, but the left hand was through the target. So it's important to duplicate those punch dynamics with your sparring partners, so that when you get in the ring, you know that you can, you're not seeing it. Everything that he throws at you, you've seen in countless rounds of sparring. I think the sparring for both guys, as in all fights, is going to be essential. And of course, each trainer will have their own philosophies with regards to sparring, with regards to how many rounds they should spar or how many rounds they shouldn't spar, with regards to overtraining and with regards to peaking at the right time, which is essential for a fighter. You want the fighter to peak at the right time. You don't want them to, quote unquote, overtrain. And that in itself is an art. How do you get a fighter to peak just at the right time? It's interesting because Conor Benn's trainer spoke about that when Eubank Jr. fought Conor Benn, they felt that actually Conor Benn peaked too early because he's so intense and so passionate with the training that he peaked too early, and therefore they had to hold him back. So essentially, when you're training a fighter, you want him to peak at the right time. I would assume the way you get a fighter to peak at the right time is number one, understanding the art of enabling a fighter to peak at the right time, but also understanding your fighter through and through. And I think maybe Moses Itauma may have a little advantage here because, like I said, Ben Davidson has been with Moses Itauma from the beginning, so he should have that more intimate knowledge of not only the understanding of how to get fighters to peak at the right time, but how to contextualize that specifically to Moses Itauma, because that will be absolutely essential. So now finally, let's talk about if there's any variables. And when we talk about variables, there's 3 things you can cover here, or maybe 4: ring sides, gloves, referee, and judges. I think the ring size is an interesting one because I don't know what ring size would benefit who, because Moses Itauma seems to walk around a lot, so that to me would suggest maybe he would want a bigger ring. But then Dillian Whyte might want to use his reach, so I'm not sure that the ring size is as essential as it may be in other fights. For example, when Lennox Lewis fought Ray Mercer, the ring was tiny, and that clearly had a benefit for Ray Mercer. Because Moses Itauma is the A side, his team will decide how big the ring is. With regards to gloves, this is an interesting one because they both punch hard. So in certain cases, when you fight a puncher, you would want the puncher to wear heavier gloves, because then their punches aren't as hard. But because they both will probably consider themselves power punchers, they probably would want to wear what is considered the punching gloves, because there's different types of gloves. And in many fights, there's always a debate or a controversy or an argument about which gloves to use. But I don't think that's particularly relevant here. What is relevant, though, is the referee. Because what will the referee allow may be essential. So if Dillian Whyte tries to implement rough tactics, if the referee is lenient, then that favors Dillian Whyte. But if the referee is strict and Dillian Whyte tries to hold and tries to push and do various things, then obviously that could lead to a detriment. So the referee's style could be essential. It could have an influence. And obviously then you have judges. I'm assuming they would have picked the judges. But there's no... I'm not sure how important those variables will be. Clearly, like I said, Moses Itauma is the A side, so I think the public perception, whether right or wrong, is that the A side fighter will mostly the A side fighter will be favoured by the judges. But generally speaking, judges should be objective. Unfortunately, boxing is a very subjective sport, so even two people with experience may look at a round and may have different outcomes as to who won the round. Okay, so we've gone quite into this. So I guess the final question is, who wins? And as I said in my last video, I really, really want Dillian Whyte to do well in this fight. It would be quite sad if he was to be knocked out early. So if Moses Itauma wins, I hope that Dillian Whyte gives a good account for himself. And I think there's good indications that he could give a good account for himself, because if he's in good shape, which the rumours is that he is in good shape, and he's going to have his strategy, and if Moses Itauma isn't on his A game and can't get him out there early, the more rounds this goes, the more of a chance Dillian Whyte is going to have. And Dillian Whyte has experience. I think a lot of people are seeing this as like a 90-10 Moses Itauma wins by knockout. I disagree. I mean, you could go 70-30, but if the fight goes longer, and if Dillian Whyte gets success with the body shots, it could go from 70-30 to 60-40 to 50-50, depending on how the fight develops. So there's a question of, can Dillian Whyte win? And the answer to that is yes. That left hook, if he catches you with it, it's game over. But also there's a scenario where if Moses Itauma can't deal with the traps that he sets, if he can't deal with the left hook, and if he can't effectively manage the body attack, there's a credible case that Dillian Whyte could win by a stoppage or on points. I do, however, think that the prevailing opinion of a Moses Itauma victory is probably the most likely outcome, but it's not written in stone. And I think it's important to remember that Dillian Whyte is very proud. I think he's a very proud man, and I think he brings a lot of his respect. And anyone who comes into the ring with his type of caliber and comes to ring, and anyone who comes into the ring with his type of caliber and comes to win and has that type of passion, that's always going to be a difficult person to beat. So I think you have to lean towards Moses if you're looking at it logically. But Dillian Whyte has a chance. And there's an even greater chance that this is going to be a really, really good fight. So I think logic says Moses, my heart says Dillian Whyte. But I think even though logically most boxing purists are going for Moses Itauma, and there is a chance that he could win early, it potentially is a much closer fight than a lot of people are giving credit. It's potentially a much closer fight, particularly if Dillian Whyte can get off this left hook and can get that investment to the body. This fight can become very interesting if it goes over 4 rounds. And like I said, I really hope that whatever happens, Dillian Whyte gives a great account of himself, because he's given a lot to boxing and I think he deserves that. So if he does go out, I hope he goes out on his shield, and I think it's going to be potentially a great fight.